ask everyone to take their seats, please? We're going to get started. If you could all take your seats, we'll try to get as back to on schedule as we can. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I am Jason Bordoff, the founding director of the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. I want to thank our partners at the Munich Security Conference for putting this moment together and for the invitation to be Master of Ceremonies today as we hear from esteemed global leaders on the critical topic of climate and security. To very briefly, because we have so many extraordinary leaders to hear from, to very briefly set the scene for why we're here today, we should start by acknowledging that climate change is quickly emerging as one of the major destabilizing forces in the world of the 21st century. More severe storms and droughts and floods and wildfires besieging ill-prepared infrastructure. But the next 30 minutes we'll spend together, we need to talk about much more than just climate impacts. The second and third order effects of climate change and the efforts to avoid those impacts by transitioning much, much faster away from fossil fuels toward net zero carbon sources of energy. All of those are going to involve a massive redistribution and revaluation of resources and wealth around the world. This is going to transform economic fortunes, capital flows, global competition, and trade patterns and trade relations around the world. And the consequences of all of this new uncertainty being injected into geopolitics is really quite profound, with the potential to impact or even threaten, if we don't anticipate and manage those risks, national security, defense readiness, cross-border relations, civil strife, migration, energy security, international cooperation, and governance at all scales. And so with this growing reality, we need to embrace the idea that the threat of climate change must be incorporated into every level of our foreign policy, our security planning, our readiness, our resilience, and our defense. We can't afford to look at climate change as a one-dimensional issue, simplified to just how we react to the physical impacts of climate change, like hardening national security infrastructure against rising sea levels or extreme events. We need to be thinking much more broadly, critically, and strategically about how climate change is posing new security threats and risks around the world. I will say on our end, this need for deeper understanding of the interconnection between climate change and the clean energy transition on the one hand, and then geopolitics, national security, and foreign affairs on the other is why at the leading global public policy school in the world, Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, we have launched a new initiative on the geopolitics of climate change and the energy transition, a collaboration between the new Institute of Global Politics, led by former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Dean Karen Yari-Milo, and the Center on Global Energy Policy, which I founded 10 years ago after leaving the National Security Council. This initiative is going to provide insights and advice to the global community on so many of these critical issues in partnership with extraordinary organizations like the Munich Security Conference. We have a really remarkable lineup of speakers today to speak to some of these issues. Again, I want to thank the MSC for bringing this together and for asking me to help organize it. And now I want to turn to Ambassador Heusgen to make some opening remarks here on behalf of MSC. Thank you for being with us.
Good afternoon, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. Please forgive me if I don't welcome you individually because we don't have the time, and I will be very short. It's a special honor to host you here today. The Munich Security Conference for many years has been stressing the importance of incorporating climate-related security risks in all climate efforts. And recent extreme weather events and other impacts of climate change have shown how much climate change acts as a security threat multiplier. And if we do not act to reduce and prevent the adverse effects of climate change, the consequences are catastrophic. The World Food Programme has highlighted that the risk of hunger could rise by 20% by 2050. And the UNHCR, and I'm very happy that Filippo Grandi is here, and I also see Amy Pope. The UNHCR has said that by 2050, climate change and the threats and the consequences, if this continues the way, this could cause 1.2 billion climate refugees by 2050. This demonstrates the dimension of what we are talking about. So COP28 offers an ideal platform to assume leadership and align priorities on these interlinked challenges. We are very happy to work with the COP presidency, which has, for the first time, put it very high on the agenda on December 3, the declaration on the interlinkages of climate relief, recovery, and peace. The declaration will be issued, which shows that this is a topic we discuss here is really high on the agenda. So we are very delighted to have leaders here from different sectors, from different regions, who are willing to address climate-related security risk and call for a joint action. So thank you very much, and I hand back over to you, Jason.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. So if I could ask the speakers who will be speaking to come, well, let's all come on stage at the same time. I think we don't have everyone here yet, but some will be trickling in as we go. You can find your name here. We're going to ask this distinguished group to share some reflections on the reason we're all here. First, I'd like to introduce Inger Andersen, the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme and Under-Secretary General of the UN, who previously served as Director General of the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And you all have a microphone on your chair.
Thank you. So first of all, many, many thanks for the invitation. I think we all beginning very much to understand the absolute criticality of climate in its own sense, but also how it has all these interlinkages. And it's a pleasure to be, and I didn't even have a chance to greet Jennifer, with these good people and such distinguished panel. Look, I have the privilege of being the head of United Nations Environment Programme, and so we have the nerdy job of issuing dire warnings, and just the other day we issued the emissions gap report that is available. We call it Broken Records, with a subtitle that the world fails to meet the climate targets, in brackets, again. It is getting tiresome to issue these reports, but anyway, when we look at where we are at, all this heavy lift that we made on the NDCs, good work, failing grade. Because when we add it up, we are coming out at 2.1 degrees or 2.5 degrees by 2100. 2.9 degrees. And then when we take all of the conditional NDCs, the NDCs that if there is money, I will also do X, Y, Z, then we get to the magnificent number of 2.5 degrees by 2100. Therefore, a failing grade. And now when we know that we are living at 1.1 or 1.2 degrees now, and we see climate change on our TV screens and in our newspapers and in our homes and societies, the reality is that we are getting a failing grade. 86 days with record heat last year alone, and obviously all the catastrophes that we see. This being the case, then, we have this understanding that climate change is not something we can build walls around. It's not something that we can, it's not the other. If you have climate change, I have climate change. It's a little bit like that. And the failure of looking at the justice transition and the just transition is one that the global community has to hold. Look, I have the privilege of living in Nairobi. And so I live in a peaceful country, but not all of the countries on that continent are as peaceful. And just a little north of us, we have South Sudan. They have oil. They also have 7.9% access to electricity. 7.9%. Now, what is the world going to tell Sudan? There has to be money on the table. There has to be all of this. This is a country in conflict for all the reasons, not necessarily only climate, but clearly the stresses and strains of a new country that has been born are part of it. So climate impacts, we know, people's movement. In the European context, it's all about people moving from other places, but living on the continent is people moving within the continent, moving to urban centers, being displaced by climate. In Yemen, you have hilltop villages that ran out of water 15 years ago. These people can't stay there. They have to move to the urban setting or seek other places. And add to that the layers of the onion of conflict, of ethnicity, of religion, of superpower politics being paid, and each layer of the onion that we peel, it gets more and more complex. But the reality is that movement within regions is obviously much, much bigger. Lebanon being the host of an enormous number of refugees, ditto for Jordan, an enormous number of refugees, many of whom from Syria were displaced by climate. Let's recall that the Syrian conflict that began in 2010, let's recall that they had lived 10 years of drought. 10 years of drought. And let's recall that it was in Daraa province where the first people moved and where the uprising began. So those issues are very real. And so when people are displaced in this manner, it has very real consequences. We at UNEP, and this will be my last point because I'm aware that time is of essence, our job is to, and it's a mandated job by member states, to issue reports when a country so asks, on the environmental impact of conflict. Because not only does climate drive conflict, conflict also drives climate and environmental damage. And so we have done some 25 reports on different conflicts, from Syria to West Balkans to Darfur to Gaza 1 and 2, and we will invariably do 3, to Ukraine, etc. And what we see, and I'm stepping a little bit beyond just climate, is, in the toxic trail of conflict, the day the guns stop, it lasts for generations. Rubble management, what to do with it? Most people will tip it into the sea, poisoning the oceans. Refinery bombing, we know from facts that it goes 20 meters into the soil. 20 meters of soil destroyed, and so on and so forth. These are the kind of facts that we know that have these absolutely detrimental aspects. When I was in Ukraine, more than 90% of all roofs have asbestos. So you see this smashed asbestos, you're breathing it in, it's everywhere. And that's what the children are running around playing on. The reality is that war has these devastating consequences, of course, and right now what we are seeing in Gaza is of a devastation that we've not seen before at that level, but very, very real. Obviously, water pollution, wastewater treatment, which will bring marine pollution and building debris with 50,000 buildings destroyed, air pollution, emissions, etc. And so the long-term impact of war on air, our terrestrial soils, as well as our people's health is very, very real. And maybe just finally, when we plan, the reality with conflict is that our infrastructure, we have always planned it based on past numbers. What's the rainfall map? What's likely to happen? The reality is that as we look now, we cannot plan based on past assumptions. So we need to rethink completely, because if we place infrastructure in a certain place, if we place irrigation in a certain place, it will attract workers and people and lives, but water may run out, causing then future conflict because now their lives have been disrupted. So we need to begin to understand that our engineers need to plan on the future, plan on IPCC pixels as opposed to past flood maps. That is one of the ways that we need to be sure that we are more robust as we look towards the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really, really helpful perspective on the topic of today. I know we're tight on time, so let's quickly move to NATO Secretary General and former Prime Minister of Norway, Jens Stoltenberg.
Thanks so much, and let me start by thanking our host and also the Munich Security Conference for convening this very important discussion, and all of us here in this room, because it is important to really try to understand better the link between climate change and security. And for all of us, it's obvious that climate change, global warming, is one of the most important challenges we face. Perhaps it's less obvious why NATO is here and why the Secretary General of NATO attended this meeting. But the reason why we are here, despite the fact that we are a military alliance dealing with deterrence and defense and working on security issues, is of course that there is a link between climate change and security. So NATO is here because climate change matters for our security, and therefore it matters for NATO. First of all, we need to fully recognize the link between climate change and security that goes both ways. Climate change is a crisis multiplier. It forces people to move. Migratory flows are increasing because of climate change already, but it also increases competition for scarce resources, and in that way, climate change is actually fueling conflict, and conflict matters for NATO and for our security. But it goes the other way around too, because wars, conflict, and conflicts makes it harder to combat climate change. Partly because it undermines the trust we need between nations to build the climate change architecture, the architecture we need to combat climate change. And also because resources that should have been used to reduce emissions are used to protect our security. Instead of protecting the planet, we need to allocate resources for protecting our security. So peace, stability, security is extremely important to enable us to combat climate change. If we don't succeed in pursuing peace, we'll not succeed in fighting climate change. So that link goes both ways. Climate change creates crisis, and crisis undermines the possibility for combating climate change. So this is at the core of what actually NATO is dealing with. Second is that in NATO we are strongly in favor of the energy transition, but we also see the challenges related to that. We need to ensure that when we implement the energy transition away from fossil fuels to more reliable and less polluting sources of energy, we have to make sure that we don't do that in a way which undermines energy security. There are not many months ago, actually 2 years ago, we had a lot of leaders within the NATO alliance that said that buying gas from Russia was purely a commercial issue. It was not a political issue at all. We should just leave it to the companies to make commercial decisions, not for the politicians to in a way to try to control those commercial decisions. Now they all realize that, of course, to be so dependent on Russian gas was a political decision. It was about our security, because Russia used gas as a tool to try to coerce us after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. We should not make the same mistakes as we develop new renewable energy sources. There is a challenge that there are a few countries which are controlling most of the technology, most of the raw materials, the rare earth minerals, which are so important for instance, solar panels or batteries. So we should not make the same mistake, being too dependent on one or two unreliable suppliers of critical commodities, raw materials, when we make the energy transition. Third message and third link between security and climate change is, of course, that NATO and NATO allies have to adapt, both to the fact that the climate is changing and also to do our part in reducing emissions. more extreme weather will impact the way we conduct our military operations, from our training to our uniforms, to the fact that naval bases will be hit by increased sea levels. That matters for the way we conduct our military operations, so it has to be included in our missions and operations and the planning. But we also need to ensure that our armed forces do their part when it comes to reducing emissions. There is no way we can get to net zero without also reducing emissions from the military sector. And if you look at big battle tanks and big battleships and fighter jets, they are very advanced and great in many ways, but they're not very, environmentally friendly. They pollute a lot. So we need to get down the emissions. We are therefore investing in programs to develop new, more environmentally technologies for military vehicles, for planes. We are using some biofuels for some jets. We are looking into how we can use solar panels to fuel our bases, also because that will reduce the resilience on fossil fuels. And of course, if we had to choose between something which is green or combat effective, we have to choose the combat effective solution. So the challenge is to ensure that in the future, the combat effective solutions are the green ones. And I'm quite optimistic that that will be the case, because there is a revolution going on in the private sector. And in the future, the most effective engines, the most effective vehicles, planes, will be the green ones. So to ensure that we are ahead of the curve, we also need to ensure that the military is moving towards a more greener and sustainable technological solution. So these are the three reasons why climate change matters for NATO, and why I'm glad that NATO has put this on top of the agenda and also formulated some specific targets of how to reduce our own emissions by 2030 and by 2050. We should be as a net zero also in the armed forces.
Thank you for those remarks, and thank you for being here. As someone who works at this intersection, it is the case that I think you don't see often enough climate leaders in the national security community and events, and vice versa. So having the head of NATO join us here at the COP is really important. I'll ask folks to keep their comments brief, because I want to make sure people stay on schedule. Many people have places to go. I'll turn next to Her Excellency Katrín Jakobsdóttir to share some comments from Iceland. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I will be brief, and I will make 3 points. One about Iceland, one about the Arctic, and one about the world, because I'm sitting next to Jens. I think he can confirm that in every NATO summit I have attended, I have spoken about 2 issues: climate and gender equality. And I think the reason for that, because maybe those are not exactly the core issues of NATO, is the fact that I come from Iceland, and there we actually use the same word for security and safety. So it's really the same word, and that has really formed the way we look at security. We look at it very holistically, and we are very used to talk about safety and security when it comes to encountering nature. And right now, the situation in Iceland is actually that we have one town of approximately 4,000 people evacuated because of a possible volcanic eruption. So we have been dealing with natural disasters all our existence. So therefore, we have always been very mindful that you need to think about security and safety when we're dealing with nature. I also must say that if we want to talk about security and safety, we should be talking about gender equality, because more women around the table make the world a better, a more peaceful, and a safer place. So I think... Thank you, women here in the room, and we need the man in our team too, because this is actually beneficial for all of us. So this is a point from Iceland. This is what makes really the world a more secure place. Number 2, the Arctic, because we're here at the COP, and we are seeing really the consequences of the climate crisis everywhere, not least in the Arctic. They're actually happening at a double or a triple pace there. We see it in Iceland, where we see our glaciers melting. One of them already disappeared. Many of them will disappear in the next few years and decades. And then we actually have a security issue, because when the ice melts, we see opportunities for mineral, oil, gas explorations, opening of northern shipping routes, increased human activity, access to natural resources, traffic. all of this will intensify disputes about control over shipping lines and international versus territorial waters. So we actually see the climate crisis being a catalyst in actually creating a security threat in the Arctic. And that's not good news for anyone, because the institutions that have actually helped us to depoliticize and stabilize the Arctic are under increased pressure. So for the Arctic to stay a region of peace and prosperity, a low-tension region, we must continue to build a transporter cooperation and rely on the norms and the values anchored in international law. And just a final very short point on the world. I think this meeting here is so important because we really need to see a change in the mindset of the world. And if there comes a clear message out of this meeting of phasing out of fossil fuels, of stop subsidizing fossil fuels, and staying on message when it comes to 1.5 degrees, I think it's a very important message. It's also a very important message to increase the funding because, as Jens said, we are spending more and more on military security, but not enough on climate security. So that would be a very important message. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Thanks for those comments and for your brevity, so we can try to work through this and hear from everyone before I know everyone has to move on to their next commitment. I'm going to turn next to Jennifer Morgan, State Secretary and Special Envoy for International Climate Action for Germany.
Thank you so much, and thank you for hosting us here. This is, I think, it's time for the COP process to also be talking about the climate security and the security issues, and we've been doing that for a while, but excellent that we're here. And I think we know that what's at stake, and we've heard very eloquently and clearly put from Secretary General why the climate crisis poses a profound threat to security. And I think we probably all have had experiences of speaking with a father who cannot feed his children from a fragile setting and then could be tempted to turn to terrorist groups in order to be able to feed his family, driven by the straw that often breaks the camel's back of the climate impacts. I think I also wanted to share a reflection on the situation based on, triggered by Russia's war of aggression. It's really, I think, viciously highlighted this connection between fossil fuel imports, energy and climate security, and peace. And here at this COP, we are having, I think, a very real conversation about the role of fossil fuels and development and scaling up renewable energy. We know that fossil fuels can diminish the economic sovereignty and our political leeway, and it can jeopardize our security. And so Germany and Europe, I think, has really learned that we have to think about energy security, climate security, and economic security all at once. We cannot be doing one or the other. And we've been really pleased to see how the MSC, OSCE, and also NATO have really increasingly been involved in this area of climate and security. And, be it by sending experts into the field with UN peace-building missions, be it by systematically translating climate security in the development of military strategies. These are all very important developments. Obviously, every tenth of a degree matters. Rise of a degree matters. Therefore, we have to be dramatically reducing emissions, as the science has told us. And as we heard years ago, every dollar for mitigation missed will cost $8 in damage management from the Stern report in 2006. So every dollar invested in mitigation is also a dollar invested in peace. So we're on this. Germany is on this. And today I'm really thrilled to announce that Germany will increase our support for the UN climate security mechanism threefold to 3 million euros. The CSM is very important. It addresses the multiple challenges of human security and climate change. And in the South Sudan, in Iraq, in the Horn of Africa, and Central Africa, and West Africa, Sahel, climate and security advisors have worked with the missions and local stakeholders, providing climate security trainings and establishing strategies. We're learning, and we need to keep moving forward on that. We also see women as leaders and agents of change facing the climate crisis and fostering peace in their communities and their countries worldwide. And that's why we are very happy to announce the new Women and Climate Security Funding Initiative in partnership with the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, to which Germany will contribute seed funding of 3 million euros to provide support for grassroots and for local women's organizations and communities that really are at the forefront of preventing and responding to climate-related conflicts. So first projects here will occur in Colombia and in the Pacific in Fiji and Solomon Islands, in Tonga and Vanuatu, to combine peace building and climate action and increase women's leadership. So at this COP, we need to step it up across the board. We know that, whether it be building the resiliency, driving down emissions, obviously, and the financing, and also yesterday I think was a milestone on the loss and damage fund to get that over the line, get it up and running. But we need to avoid those losses and damages and create safe places for people around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those comments, and thanks for those new commitments you've announced from Germany. I'm going to turn quickly now to Prime Minister Kallas from Estonia.
Yes, thank you. I think everybody understands that war is not good for climate, but as many of you mentioned before, wars are also started because of scarcity of resources. So that is very much related to climate as well, and that's why we have to tackle both of those issues. And I just don't want to repeat what has already been said, but I just bring a few more points to the table, bringing the example of the Russian war in Ukraine. There's also a new tool of warcraft, which is ecocide. I mean, when we saw how the Novakhovka dam was blown up, then actually it was, a huge natural catastrophe created because of war, because of, trying to get what you want with power. And that's why I think we have to keep this in mind, that all these kinds of tools in the aggressor's hands are dangerous, and that's why we have to fight the aggressors, of course, every possible way. Then another point that you, Jens, mentioned, the energy, using energy as a weapon in the warcraft, and it's true that we shouldn't build new dependencies on parties that don't share the same values as we do, because that might end in a conflict. Every connection you have, the other side might also hurt you if you are not friends. Then second point is that Ukraine has been the breadbasket of Europe, and so really with this flooding of its large amounts of arable land actually means a great deal to Africa, that the resources there, and then it also creates the pressure of migration pressure, which is again a vulnerability of different regions. So this is something that we have to keep in mind. And the third point is the mining pollution. I mean, you have vast lands that are mined, and you can't use them for agriculture unless they are demined. And of course, also putting to this security picture all the resources that go into producing weaponry and ammunition that don't go to saving the climate. But at the same time, we have this I might say that we can't choose between those things, because if we say that, okay, we are not fighting because let the aggressor have what the aggressor wants, then actually they are not doing anything for the climate, and then we are ending up in a worse world as well. So we can't say that what we could be criticized is that you are doing the same because you are producing ammunition and weaponry, but we have to, because it's a freedom and a sovereignty of countries that is at stake here. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. And to conclude, I think few people have thought more about climate change than John Kerry as my country's special presidential envoy for climate, or more about foreign policy and security as our former Secretary of State and a longtime U.S. Senator. Can you bring us to conclusion by helping us think about how we should think about the intersection between the two?
Thank you, sir. Thanks, Jason, very, very much. Thanks for all you are doing. And what a pleasure to be here with this terrific panel. And I thank you, and I apologize to everybody for running behind day one, and I'm already running behind. I'm sitting here thinking, first of all, it's really dangerous to join a panel and then speak, and you don't have a clue what half the panel said. So I'm taking a great risk here in that. But, think about this in macro terms, in a sense. The struggle of human beings on the planet with life itself has always been and remains sort of how do we organize ourselves? How do we govern? What do we decide to do to provide for citizens in the ways that the evolution of ideas in history is quite fascinating, particularly in the 18th, 19th centuries when the rights of man became so prominent, the age of reason, the Enlightenment, all of these things. I mean, that's really what we're engaged in. You get up in the morning, you go to work, you try to contribute through the work you do to a better world, better society, go home, have a better life. And we in government directly try to help set the structure for that governance, for that behavior. Well, now we are faced with artificial intelligence, and all that has done to change some perceptions, and certainly war and daily life. And now we are obviously coming out of COVID-19, perhaps, but we've been organizing ourselves globally around that crisis. Meanwhile, Ukraine, the weaponization of fuel, of energy, and of course, what's happening in Gaza and the continuation of this long struggle between Palestinians and Israelis. So if you think things are struggling today, if you think there is a chaos to some degree to the way in which we're trying to organize ourselves, wait till you see what happens when the full measure of the climate crisis hits, if we stay where we are today. 80% of the population that is most exposed to the threat of drought, water problems, food problems, delivery systems, and you don't organize people particularly effectively when they're starving and they can't grow crops and there isn't water and you don't have the ability to be able to build a community and you're thinking about migrating because migration is the only way left to you to be able to provide for your life. That's not an equation that is going to create peace and stability. In fact, it will aggrandize all threats. And everything that you see that is going to happen to countries anywhere in the world now, and to people anywhere in the world now, and is happening, is going to happen to a greater degree, not because John Kerry says so, or Jens Stoltenberg, or Jennifer Morgan, or anybody here, but because every scientist worth their salt in the world who submits peer-reviewed analyses, of which there are none to the contrary of what is happening with crisis, but they are all documenting what we're seeing happen to the world. When you see that unfolding in front of your eyes, that is a security threat of the largest order. If 80% of the populations of those areas most negatively affected by the climate crisis are in Africa and South Asia, which they are, there's a problem. We already have climate migrants in the world. We already see people drowning in the Mediterranean, struggling to go from a place they can't live and feed themselves in to a place where they may be able to. We know what happened in Germany, Christoph and Jennifer, when massive numbers of people became weapons of migration policy, when a certain leader could just turn the dial up, releasing people out of prison, out of camps, and pushing them into Europe. That changed the politics of Europe and Germany. And that unfolds to a much greater degree, folks, as we mount in this crisis. Now, we will mount in this crisis, inevitably, if we don't do the things the scientists have told us we need to do. That's what this COP is all about. And our Defense Department has for 10 or 15 years now defined the climate crisis as a threat multiplier. And we are already responding to changes in readiness, in deployment of troops, in capacities of certain technologies to survive in great heat, or in, to be able to fight a war in a certain kinds of climate impact. And it will have effect, and it has effect today. So, we humans are proving that we really do have trouble connecting the dots, because the dots have been connected for us going back to Arrhenius, a Swedish scientist who in 1898 said there's something called climate crisis change coming. Rachel Carson wrote about it in the 1950s, way ahead of her time and our time. And then, of course, Jim Hansen told us about it in 1988 when I was in the Senate with Al Gore and others, and we listened to this testimony telling us it's here now. Here's what's happening, and here's what's going to happen. And despite all the warnings about what's going to happen, we have not organized ourselves as if we are actually in a war and fighting a war. But it is a security issue equally impactful on countries. 30 million people disrupted in one event in Pakistan, a flood. And then countless numbers of people, 7 million people are dying every year, right now, as a consequence of greenhouse gases. It's pollution, folks. And there was a time when we used to say, oh, we're going to clean up the pollution, and we're going to, make people who do it, pay for it. And here we are struggling to be able to do what is just plain old common sense. But make no mistake, this is as deep a security issue as you can get, because lives are being lost to a far greater number than are being lost to the violence that we see in the world. So, thank you to the Munich Security Conference for putting this on the table here. There should be no discussion of the climate crisis that does not entail what are the security implications of what is going to unfold. And believe me, if we are past the tipping points that Johann Rockström of the Potsdam Institute in Berlin tells us we may be past, the Arctic, the Antarctic, the coral reef, the permafrost, the Barents Sea, we're going to see meters of sea level rise. And who is that going to affect? And what masochistic, warped leader somewhere in the world is not going to say, okay, boy, this is an opportunity for power, and this is an opportunity for us to, invoke an ideology or a cult or a mythology. That's a security threat. And it will all come as societies unfold, seeing the lack of capacity of government to deliver. And that's why we're seeing a lot of this alt-right and other kinds of, growth, because it's a simplistic response to the lack of delivery of the services that are expected in governments around the world. And if governments don't deliver, people take it into their own hands. And that's when you wind up with demagogues. And when you have demagogues, you have security threats that are bigger than anything else the world will ever see. So I hope we will, in every conversation, sorry to go on a little bit, that we will factor this in and recognize this is yet another motivation beyond health, beyond economies, beyond safety and security. This is as big a motivation as there ought to be for us to take the warning seriously. And we're still too much business as usual, still stuck with money and greed and indifference and arrogance, unfortunately dominating some of the choices that are being made in various parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary Kerry. It was not a hand signal to stop. I thought you were passing me the microphone because we were sharing. So thanks to all of you for being here today. I think we heard today clearly about why the impacts of climate change are really one of the major potential destabilizing forces of the 21st century. You all see that in the work you do every day. I see my friend David Miliband there, and I'm sure he sees that at the International Rescue Committee, and so many of you in the work that you're doing. We also heard about why the efforts to prevent those to the best we can by rapidly accelerating the transition to a net zero economy on a speed and scale unprecedented by the standpoint of the history of energy transitions has huge opportunity to enhance energy security, but if it is mismanaged, if it is disorderly, if we don't get it right, can also be a source of significant geopolitical risk. And that's why we need to surface those issues, talk about them by bringing national security leaders and foreign policy leaders together with climate leaders in forums like this here at COP. So I want to thank the Munich Security Conference for convening this and bringing it together, for continuing to work on this issue, draw attention to it. We will continue to do that with the work we do at Columbia University, and I'm sure all of you will in your capacities as well. Please join me in thanking this extraordinary group of speakers we've been able to hear from today. I'm going to ask everyone on stage just to stay here for a moment for a photo, and for the rest of you to move through that door over there to the roundtable discussion.